Lance, in a moment, we're going to spend most of our time today talking about establishing rhythms in our lives to protect the health of our souls, our most important relationships, and our ministries. However, one of the foundational questions that I always ask is, are we trying to fix a problem that doesn't need to be solved? So with that in mind, I guess the first question I have for you, and my goodness, this is probably the biggest softball question that you've ever had to answer in an interview like this, is this: do pastors and church leaders have a pace of life problem that needs to be fixed? I mean, is creating healthy margin a need for those of us in ministry? Or maybe to go all John Mark Comer on you, do we really need to be ruthless about eliminating hurry?
Wow, I appreciate the softball question. So, as you might guess, I actually think the answer to all of those is yes. And I do think pace of life is a huge issue for a lot of leaders. And then I think as pastors, because we're about eternity and people are dying and going to hell, and what we do matters, we can sort of justify this insane pace of life and not embracing our limits, because after all, we're doing it for Jesus. And I think it's, especially today, it is more than just pace, it's also complexity. It's leadership drain, all the shifts and adjustments and things that pastors have had to deal with, the political polarization over the last 3 years. So I think, one, you have already pastors who drive hard, work hard, and run fast, and then add all the complexity. And so the result is, I think, a lot of leaders feeling empty. And now we know from some of the most recent Barna stuff that a lot of pastors are seriously considering quitting. The most recent one looks like the number's now going to be somewhere right around 40%, was 38%, 3 or 4 months ago, and like 29% just a few months earlier. So I think for me, what it does is it raised the stakes on this whole issue of self-care, and that pastors have to learn, because of complexity and pace, that self-care is not selfish. I
Mhm.
want to, like, could I say that again? Self-care is not
Yes.
selfish. It's actually good stewardship. And it's going to help you stay in ministry over the long haul. So all that to say, yeah, I think the pace issue is a big deal.
Yeah. And by the way, Lance, on that note, I actually think you were the first person to recommend to me John Mark Comer's book. And
Yeah.
I finally slowed down enough to read it. And it's convicting. So thank you for
It
that.
is.
Um, if indeed this is a problem that needs to be fixed, where should we begin? I mean, how do we begin to establish healthy rhythms in our lives so that this challenge that we're facing can be in the rearview mirror?
Yeah. I think for me, the core issue, and if you can get this one, I think the rest of it can fall into place much easier. But I think you got to take ownership of your own life. Like, I have to realize, often as a pastor, I would play the victim card, like, well, I can't help it. This is just how life is in ministry, and it's just hard. And yes, there's sacrifices for my family, and all of that is true. But there's a point where that becomes destructive in your own life. And so I think I had to realize that I'm not a victim. I'm actually the perpetrator. And and I'm responsible for my life, and I'm responsible to lead myself well. And then I think, to get a little more nuanced and practical, I would say I had to learn how to address both the internal and external issues as it relates to healthy rhythm. So internal is, I had to ask myself, like, Lance, why are you so driven? Why are you compulsively busy all the time? Why can you not say no? Like, what's going on inside of you that makes it difficult for you to have a healthy rhythm? And until I was willing to address that, I really didn't get much traction. And I'm a bit of a productivity junkie, so I'm always trying to figure out how to work smarter and get more done in less time. But uh, no matter how hard I worked, if I had an internal drivenness that was out of control, it just made life and ministry just really challenging. So I think there's the internal issue. And then I think also there is the external issue of you really have to grab your calendar by the throat, and you have to really be aggressive with your schedule and making sure that you're getting the big rocks in your calendar first, things like your family time and things like Sabbath and things like rest. And I think just, making sure that externally I'm managing my time in a way that allows for healthy rhythm.
All right, so let's continue. Let's talk a little bit
Yeah.
about Sabbath, practicing Sabbath. Does that still need to be a priority, or is that just a legalistic carryover from the Old Testament? And if it is still important, just practically speaking, what should a Sabbath day look like?
Couple of thoughts on this. One is, I would say to someone, if you're going to get serious about this, study it. I mean, really go to scripture, because here's what I believe: unless you develop a biblical conviction about this, the chances of you really meaningfully practicing this and integrating into your life are not very high, because the gravitational pull of busyness in ministry will always win, unless you go, you know what? This is God's best for me, and it is a biblical command. On the practical side, Tony, I've created this little template that I think can give people a way to think about practicing Sabbath no matter what season of life they're in. So it's just these 5 words, and we won't unpack them, but prepare. There's some work involved in getting ready to not work, right? Stop, which is what the word Sabbath means. It just means to quit, stop. What would it look like for you to stop for 24 hours? Rest, which is physical rest, but also being at rest in your soul, giving up obligation and work. The 4th word would be delight. Like, I think a lot of Christians are delight deficient. And so what are you doing that puts delight in you on a Sabbath? And then the last word is worship. There ought to be more unhurried time just to be with God and honor him on a Sabbath. And so I think someone could take those 5 words and go, what would that look like for me and my family to put those into practice?
Mm-hmm. All right. So this question, and again, maybe it's a step further as we're talking about rhythms in our life. This is actually coming from one of the folks on Twitter that asked this. I often hear I often hear from pastors who have questions about sabbaticals, and that's what this pastor was asking about.
Okay.
I mean, that has been a practice for years in academic circles, but I think it's becoming more commonplace even within businesses in the last number of years. But have you ever been on a sabbatical, and what coaching would you give to pastors or church leaders who are considering a sabbatical?
Here's some practical things I would say to people who are thinking about a sabbatical. Number one is, I think one of the goals of sabbatical is remove obligation and pressure. So whatever feels like obligation and pressure, I think you're trying to set that aside so that physically, emotionally, spiritually, your life can just breathe. And then I always tell pastors, because this is a notorious thing, like, here would be my number one practical piece of advice: do not overschedule your sabbatical. Do not just fill it up with a bunch of random stuff. Give it some breathing room. And I always say, because you're probably more tired than you realize, you should front load your sabbatical with physical rest. Like, give yourself space to sleep in, take some naps, fall asleep watching a movie. Just give yourself the freedom to do that. On a practical side, I would also say you got to figure out what you're going to do with your technology. What are you going to do about email? What are you going to do about people contacting you? A lot of people I know get kind of a burner phone that only their family, have the number to. But I think you better figure out how you're going to unplug, because it's not just not going into the office. You know how tethered you can be just to your phone. So, and then just a couple other practical things. I always say, do something to create a great memory or two with your spouse and with your kids, because you're not going to get many moments like this in your life where you get this much of an extended break. So, like, what could you do to kind of create a shock and awe moment, in your marriage? Or take your kids. One of my friends, he took each one of his kids on a personal trip, just him and them, during his sabbatical. And And then I think as you come out of your sabbatical, I always say, do a personal retreat. Like take a day, day and a half, 2 days. Listen to God. What has He said to you? What should you pay attention to now moving back into normal life? What should you pay attention to that He shared with you during your sabbatical? And then if there's one mistake I made, Tony, I made many, but the one big one I wish I had a do-over on with my sabbatical is I would think more about how I would re-enter life after 3 months away.
All right. So before we finish up, and you kind of alluded to this a moment ago, I don't think we can talk about pace of life without speaking at least for a moment about technology. I mean, most of us are living almost every moment of our lives with a device either in our hands or in our front pockets. And it seems like that's a recipe for disaster if we're trying to get to a healthier pace with our time. So any practical advice you can offer as it relates to that challenge?
Yeah, I have a lot of passion around this because I think this issue, way more than we realize, has impact on the health of our souls. My phone and the constant distraction has implications for my ability to pay attention, to actually pray, to read my Bible, to meditate, to practice silence and solitude, or even to be present in a conversation. And so, man, we could spend a whole podcast on this, and we know we're not going to go back. We're not going to all go out and burn our iPhones, but we better learn how to manage them better. And I think that's at 3 levels. Just my own personal management of it for Lance as a soul and a human being, how it plays out in my family with my spouse and my kids, and then the implications it has even for our teams at church. And so I would say, man, just get aggressive and have some good practices around unplugging and disconnecting from your phone. Maybe you should give your phone a Sabbath.
All right. So as we wrap up, I mean, you mentioned it earlier. I just think this is a challenging season for pastors in many ways. But because of that, so many pastors are even considering, do I want to remain in ministry or not? And so as we wrap up today's conversation, Lance, any final thoughts or encouragement that you could share with pastors and church leaders who are listening?
Gosh, as one of the old guys now, I just want to, if I wish I could sit down and have a cup of coffee with everybody listening and look them in the eye and just say, thank you for staying faithful to Jesus and faithful to the church. Thank you for serving down in the trenches in probably what is one of the most complex moments in the history of the church. And it's worth it. It matters, and what you do matters, and the gospel still has power, and the church is the hope of the world. And so thank you for what you do. And then I would say, and along the way, don't forget to become a student of your own soul, of your inner life. Pay attention to what's going on inside of you. The Christian life flows from the outside to from the inside to the outside. Jesus talked about that a lot. And then just my mind goes to Deuteronomy 30, the last phrase of the whole chapter. As God has invited them into this amazing life, he finishes the chapter with these words, "For the Lord is your life." And I would just say to pastors today, the church isn't your life. Ministry is not your life. Jesus is your life. And when you can get that one at the center, now you can do ministry out of the overflow of that. So let him be first and center of everything.